Code Explained says hi. Today we're going to create a multiple choice quiz using JavaScript. Let's talk about our tutorial plan. We're not going directly to open our text editors. We will first go and see the logic behind the code and then type it. Let's see a preview of the quiz. We have here a button to start the quiz. Then every question here has 10 seconds. If you don't answer a question in 10 seconds, we will move to the next question automatically. And then we'll start the counter. Now, if your answer was correct, we turn this to green. And instead, if your answer was not correct, we turn this to red. And then we show the score at the end of the quiz. Let's go. Let's start with the HTML part. We're going to create a very basic HTML code, then link our style.css and quiz.js files to our HTML file. Then the first div will be the start quiz. And then our quiz container, and the last one is our score container. Then we will set both the quiz and the score container display property to none, as we need to show only the start quiz button at the beginning of the quiz. And inside our quiz we have the question image, the question itself, and then the timer. Inside the timer we have the counter, the background time gauge, and the time gauge. And then we have our choices. All the choices have the same class choice. They have different IDs, A and B and C, and a onClick event, which fires up a CheckAnswer function. The CheckAnswer gets as argument the ID of the choice. Now here we have the progress. The progress tells the user how many questions he will answer, and also if he answered the question correctly or not. And inside our score container, we will show to the user its score %, and based on the score, we will show an image. Let's talk about the JavaScript part. We first select all elements because we need to change the inner HTML or to update the inner HTML of our element. To select an element using JavaScript, we will use the getElementById method. We will select the start, then the quiz, the question image, the question, the counter, the time gauge, all the choices, the progress also, and the score container. Then we will create our questions. Our questions will be inside an array. So we'll say let questions equals an array, and inside our array, every element will be an object. These objects will have the same properties. So the first one is the question itself. Then the question image or the image source related to our question. Then the choice A and the choice B and C, and the correct answer. So for example, if the correct answer was the choice A, we will say correct as A. Then with the same way we'll create the other questions. Now to access these properties, we will say questions. So the first question has an index of 0. Then we will say .question to access the first property of our first element. The same for the others. Remember, your questions are not safe because anyone can see the page source code. So anyone can see the answers of your questions. Now to display a question to the user, we will need a function. So before that, we will create some variables. The first one will be the last question index. First, let's say we have an array which has these elements, 4 elements. If we say array.length, this will gives us 4. But remember, the last element index is not 4, it is 3. So the index of the last element of an array, it's the array.length minus 1. So that's what we are going to do. So we'll say let last question index equal questions.length minus 1. Then we will create another variable called running question index. It is the index of the running question, the question the user is answering, and then we will set it equal to 0. Now inside our render question function, we will create a variable called q for question equals questions with index running question index. So I created this variable so I won't be a need to type in all this line again. Then we will need to update our image, so we'll say question image that inner HTML equals the image tag with the source question.image source. Then the question.inner HTML equals the question.question. And then this is the code for the choices. Now when we set running question index equals 0, and then if we call the render question function, here we are displaying to the user the first question. So to move to the next question, it's easy. We will just increment the running question index by 1 and then render the question again. Let's now talk about the progress render. Here is our progress dev, and inside are devs with the same class prog. So here means that we have 3 questions. If there is 4 questions, we must have 4 of these. We must create 4 of these. To do that, we will need a function called progress render. This function we will use a for loop that starts from 0 and ends at last question index. The last question index is included. Then we will say progress that inner HTML, then the addition assignment operator, and then the dev element, which has a class prog and id equal to question index, which means that this dev will have the id 0, 1, and 2. Now let's say that the user is in the first question, means that the running question index equals 0. Then if the user answered this question correctly, we need to turn this to green, which means we need a new function called answer is correct. This function here, we will get the element by id of the running question index, which is 0 if the user is in the first question, then .style that background color equals green, which means this line will change the dev with the id 0 to green, its background color to green. Let's say now the user didn't answer the question correctly, which means we need to change this background color dev to red. We will need here a new function called answer is wrong, which use the same code. The difference is we set the background color to red instead of green. As you can see here, both the functions answer is correct, answer is wrong use the same code. The only difference is the color here. So you can use a one function to achieve the same thing. But I still prefer to use different questions. Now let's go and talk about counter render. Our counter render has a number which starts from 0 and a background or a time gauge background. Before we create our function, we will need to create some constant and variables first. The first constant is our question time, which is equal to 10, which means 10 seconds for every question. Then our time gauge will have a width of 150 pixels. We will create a constant called gauge width, which is equal to 150. Now the counter starts from 0. We will need a variable called count, which is equal to 0. Then we will calculate a constant called gauge progress unit, which is equal to gauge width divided by question time. In this case, we have 150 divided by 10, which is equal to 15, which means the time gauge width will be changed or will be incremented by 15 pixels at a time. Now let's talk about our function counter render. Our function counter render will be called every 1 second. We will see that in a moment. Inside our counter render, we will create a condition. We will say if count is less than or equal to question time, which means we didn't exceed the time given for every question, then we will change the counter inner HTML to count. Then we will need to change the time gauge with it by the gauge progress unit multiplied by count plus the pixels unit. Don't forget this. Then we will increment our variable count by 1, which means if the variable count is 0, then the width of our time gauge is 0. So here, if it's 1, then the time gauge width is 15, like so. If it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. Now, if we exceed the question time, we will need to set the counter to 0, so we need to start over from 0. And also, if we exceed the question time, means that the user didn't answer the question, which means the answer is wrong. So we need to update the progress bar. And then we need to move to the next question. But first we have to check if we have or if we still have left questions. So we'll say if running question index is less than the last question index. If true, which means there is still some questions, we will say running question index plus plus to move to the next question and then render the new question. Else, we will clear interval of timer. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then we need to show the score to the user. Now, how can we call the counter render every 1 second? For that, we'll use a function called setInterval that gets in two arguments: the function counter render and the number in milliseconds. 1000 milliseconds is 1 second, which means now our setInterval will call the counter render every 1 second. Then we will set this to a variable called timer, so it will be possible to stop running the setInterval, saying the interval of timer. You have seen the div element for our choices. They all have a onClick event, which fires up a CheckAnswer function. Let's now talk about the CheckAnswer function. Our CheckAnswer function gets as argument answer, which may be A, B, or C, based on the button clicked by the user. Inside our CheckAnswer, we will check if the questions with index running question index that correct. That's how we know the correct answer of a question equals to the answer given by the user. If it's true, we will increment the score by 1. We must create first a variable called score. Then we need to update the progress bar, saying answer is correct. Else, we say answer is wrong. Then, after the user has answered the question, we will need to move to the next question. But before that, we will need to check if we didn't exceed the number of questions. So we'll say if running question index is less than the last question index. If so, we set the count to 0, so we will start over from 0 for the next question. Then we will increment the running question index by 1. Then we will display the new question. Else, we'll clear the interval of timer, and then we will show the score to the user. Now let's talk about how do we start the quiz. When we first begin the quiz, what is shown is the start quiz button. This has an ID equal to start. We selected this element using the getElementById. Now we need to add an event listener to start, which is the click event. So whenever we click the start button or the start div, we will fire up the start quiz function. The function start quiz. We will set the start.startDisplay to none, so we will hide this div. Then we will render the counter, which means we will set the count to 0 and the time gauge with it to 0. Then we will use the set interval to call the counter render every 1 second. For the timer variable here, we must define it outside the function start quiz, so any other function can access or can change the value of timer. After, we will render the progress, and then we will render our question, the image, the question, and the choices. And then the last thing, we have to display our quiz dev. So we'll say quiz.style.display equals block. Because if you remember, in our HTML code, we will set the style of our quiz dev to none. The last thing is the score render, but I would love to talk first about the ternary operator. So let's say we have a y variable, and then x will get 1 if y is equal to 1, and x will get 0 if y equals to 0. Using an if statement, we will say if y equals 1, then x gets 1, else x gets 0. Using the ternary operator, we will say x equals y equals 1, the condition, then the question mark. So if y equals 1, x will get 1, will receive 1, else it will receive 0. Now let's say we have an else if statement. So let's say if y equals 1, then x will receive 1, else if y equals 0, then x will receive 0, else x, for example, receives 2. Then using the ternary operator, we will say x equals the condition, y equals 1, the question mark. So if this condition is true, x will receive 1, else if now the other condition, y equals 0, another question mark. If this condition now is true, x will receive 0, else x will receive 2. So in general, the syntax for a ternary operator is this. We say, or we type in the condition, then a question mark, then the expression if the condition is true, then a colon, and the expression if the condition is false. Now let's type in the code for the score render function. So our function score render, the first thing is we are going to set the score container that style.display to block, because if you remember, in our HTML code we set the score container display to none. Then we'll create a score percent variable, so we are going to calculate the score percent based on the score of the user. So we'll say score divided by the question length multiplied by 100. Then I will use the math.round to get rid of the float number. Then let's create a variable called image, which will store the source of an image. We have here 5 images which are inside our folder image. Then based on the score percent, we will show one of these images to the user. So if the score percent, if the score of the user is greater than or equal to 80, we will show this image. If it's greater than 60, we'll show this image. Greater than or equal to 40, this one. Greater than or equal to 20, and else this one. So we will go and say if the score percent is greater than or equal to 80, then if it's true, the image will receive the path or the source of this image. Else, if the score percent is greater than or equal to 60, we will show this one. Then if the score percent is greater than 40, we'll show the third image. Then the score percent is greater than or equal to 20, we will show the second image. Else, we will show the first image. Then we will go and say score container dot inner HTML equal to the image and the paragraph. The source of the image is our variable image here. and the score percent is our variable here. So are you ready to type in the code? Before we go, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe to our channel, and if you are, don't forget to click the bell to get notified about every new video. Now let's go and type in the code for our tutorial. If you want to follow the tutorial step by step, you will need to click the link in the description to go to our repo on GitHub, go to multiple choice quiz JavaScript, then choose the quiz starter template, then download it and save it to your desktop, for example. Extract the files and then open your project. You'll find a directory contains images, an index.html file which is empty, the quiz.js also, and the style already typed in. Now I'm giving a title for our quiz, then I'm gonna link the style sheet, style.css file, and then our script, our code, our JavaScript code. I'm going to create a container, and then the start div for start quiz button, then our quiz container, and last our score container. Inside our quiz container we have the question container, the question div, then the question image div for our image, the image related to a question, then the progress bar, then the choices. We have three choices. We're gonna start with 3 choices. The first one has an ID of a unclick event, CheckAnswer. I'm gonna copy this 3 times. This is the one for B, and this is the one for C. Now inside our timer we have the counter, so the number, and then the time gauge background with the gray color, and then the time gauge itself. I'm gonna run this in my browser. Now the first thing we're going to do is to hide the quiz container and the score container. So I'm gonna add in a style property, which is display. I'm gonna set this to none, and also I'm gonna do the same thing for our score container. Now I'm gonna select all these elements, so I'm just gonna copy them. The last one is the score. So to select an element in JavaScript, we can use the getElementById method. So all these are constants, so I'm gonna say const, and I'm gonna give the variable name or the constant name in a while. I'm gonna say here start for the button, then the quiz, the container, the question, then the question image, then the choice, the first choice. We have 3 choices, B and C, then the counter and the time gauge, the progress bar, and the score div. So this is how we select elements using JavaScript. Now let's create our questions. Remember, our questions are an array, so I'm gonna say let questions equals an array, and inside every element is an object, so I'm gonna say question. Then the properties are question, the image source or the image path, then the choice A, the choice B, the last choice C, and the correct answer. So we need to put in our or the correct answer for the question. So I'm gonna just use some examples here, like what does HTML stand for the first question. Then the image related to this question. So this is it's called html.png. Let's say I'm gonna use just correct and wrong, so we will know which is the while answering we will know the correct from the wrong answer. I'm gonna say CSS. I'm gonna use the image for CSS. I'm gonna change this, so now the correct answer is the choice B. So I'm gonna say correct is B. Then I'm gonna create the last question. So here I'm gonna say correct. So the choice C is the correct, so correct will get C. Now let's create some variables. The first variable is a constant, which is last questions. So the index of last questions is questions.length -1. Then a variable running question. So that's how we keep track of the running question. Now we need a function to render the question. So I'm gonna call it render question. I'm gonna set a new variable called q. So I won't be in need to type in all that line again. So the question.inner HTML equals, so a paragraph, then between the p tags I'm gonna put the question, so q that question. Then I'm gonna change the image or set the image, question image.inner HTML, the image tag, then the source. So it's the q dot image source. The choices are the choice A dot inner HTML equals q dot choice A. I'm gonna copy this 3 times, the one for B and the one for C. So before we render the question, we need first to hide our start button. So I'm gonna say style.display equals none. Then I will need to render the question, and after that I will set our quiz to display to block, because if you remember we hid the quiz. Oops, there's an error. So the error is not here, is not in JS. Okay, I'm gonna go to, yep, I didn't set the ID for the C choice. Now it's working. Now let's go and create the progress render. So I'm gonna say render progress, a comment, then the function render progress. So we have here 3 questions. So we need to put in the progress bar 3 circles. So I'm gonna start from 0 until the last question. So I'm gonna use a for loop here. Then I will say progress.inner HTML. So the devs, all the devs have the same class, which is prog. And then they have the IDs. The IDs are 0, starts from 0. Now let's render the progress. Yep, you can see here we have 3 questions. Let's create the counter render. I'm going to say function render counter. I'm going to create first the variable count and set it to 0. Then the variable our constant question sign, so 10 seconds. We have 10 seconds for every question. Then a constant called gauge unit progress or gauge unit. Before that, I'm gonna set the gauge width, which is 50 150 pixels. The gauge width equals the gauge unit equals the gauge width divided by the question time. I'm going to use an if statement here, so I'm going to say if count is less than questions, the question time, so it didn't exceed the 10 seconds, then the counter.inner.html equals count, and then I'm going to change the gauge width, the time gauge width, style.width equals count times the gauge unit, and then I'm going to increment count by 1. We're going to the next second. Then else, if we exceed the time, we will set the count to 0. I'm going to call the render question here. Oh, count is not defined. I'm going to set this to 0. I have to put this to top. Yes, now I have here the 0 appeared for the counter. Now let's set our timer variable. So our timer variable equals set interval that will call the render counter every 1 second, which is 100 or 1000 milliseconds. So now as you can see here, the counter is moving, but we have a problem. The time gauge remains the same. So okay, I have to add here pixels, the unit, and it's working. Right. I'm going to go and put this inside the function. I'm going to call it start quiz. So the function start quiz. Now I will need to use an event listener to our start button. So I'm going to say start.add event listener. So on click event, we will run the start quiz function. Let's try that. So as I click, yes, so we'll run the quiz once I click. Then if I click on the answers, I'll get an error as we didn't define the check answer yet. So I'm gonna go and create a function, the check answer function, which gets as an argument an answer. It may be A or B or C. Now I'm gonna say if the answer equals the questions of a running question, the running question, not correct. So here the answer is correct if the condition is true. So we need to increment the score. So I'm going to create the score and initialize it with 0. Then else, then the question is incorrect or wrong. So I will need to change the progress bar to green, I guess, yeah, to green. And if it's wrong, we need to change it to red. So I'm going to go and create 2 functions for that. You may use just 1 function to do the job. Well, I still prefer to use 2 functions. The first one is answer is correct. So I'm going to say document get element by ID of the running question dot style dot background color equals to green. And I'm just gonna copy this. So the answer here is wrong. The color is red. So if the answer is correct, it's green. If the answer is wrong, it's red. Let's go and try that. So if I click correct, it's green. If I click wrong, it's red. Now when the user clicks a button, we need to go to the next question. But before that, we need to check if there is left questions. So I'm going to say if running question is less than last questions, we increment the running question and then render. Let's try that. So yes, then second and the third. I have here a problem. I didn't change the image. This is for the image for the last question. Just js.png. Let's try that again. And it's working. Now we have to set the counter to 0 after answering a question. So I'm gonna just say count equals 0. Let's try that. So this is, if I click the next question, the counter resets. We will add this same code inside our render counter. So if the count exceeds the question time, we need to go to the next question, just like so. And then also we need to change the progress bar. So the question is wrong because the user didn't answer the question. And yeah. Now else, if we don't have any left questions, we need to end the quiz and show the score to the user. The same in the render question, render counter. So I'm gonna say clear interval of our timer. And then we need to render the score. We didn't create yet. So for the score render function, we first need to display our score container. So I'm gonna say style.display equals block. Okay, for the variable is score def, not score. Score is the variable. A block. Then we need to calculate the amount of questions percent the user answered. I'm gonna say constant score percent equals math that round of 100 times the score divided by the questions that length, the number of questions. Then we will need to choose an image of the 5 images we have. First, there's images. So it's based on the score. I'm gonna say let image equal. So I'm gonna use the ternary operator. So I'm gonna score percent. If it is greater than or equal 80, we'll show the 5th image. Then I'm just gonna copy this. So if it's above 60%, we'll show the 4th image. 40, the 3rd. If it's 20, the 2nd image, and then we'll show, if else, we'll show the 1st image. Now we will need to update the score div inner HTML. We're going to say image tag in the source. So it's image. And I'm gonna show the score percent. So score percent. Let's try that. So I'm gonna go and answer the questions to get to the last of the quiz. So it didn't work. I have a problem here. Sorry guys. I'm gonna check where is the problem. Okay, the ID here is score. Okay, there is our image, the score. So I'll need to go to the style. Okay, for the ID I used the score container, not just score. Sorry guys. Yes, now it's working just fine. So I'm gonna see a score container as well. Now let's check that again. So I'm going to click correct, run, correct, and this is the score at the end. Now let's check if we get 0%, so we get the right image, 33% the right image, and then the 67% the right image again. So everything's working great. So thank you guys for watching this video. I hope the tutorial helped you. I hope the tutorial was easy to follow. If you have any questions, post them below in a comment. So if you guys need me to make a tutorial, just comment below. Thanks again. Don't forget to like my video and subscribe to my channel.